Hello.
Hello, how are you?
I am good.
We still have some post Cannes VidCon hangover, I feel
Even
like.
though we weren't there.
That's right. It impact
Imagine how
wide-ranging.
bad it would be had we gone.
I mean, I think I'm reading how bad it was.
Well, actually, I just read yesterday, if you want to be thankful that you weren't at VidCon, that people left are coming away from VidCon with both bed bugs and COVID.
Double whammy. Oh, I did not. Oh, let's have a moment of silence for those people. That is rough. That is
Super,
really,
super rough. Yeah.
yeah, where's the TikTok about that? Well, actually, there probably are TikToks about that. Yikes. Okay. I was more highbrowing it, like, you know, some topics that have caught
Yes.
my eye in the recaps of Cannes, especially.
Yeah, yeah. So
And
you had a great idea for today's episode.
okay,
So
do you want me
you're
to tee
going
it up?
to, what? It is a great idea. You're going to share like Cannes was such a big thing. I guess it's a big thing every year. I feel like with social media, it just gets bigger and bigger.
Hmm.
You're going to share some of like the big edicts that have
Right.
supposedly come out of it. And we'll lump, I think some of them were kind of blended with VidCon because those were both happening at the same time. And then you and I are going to like tackle each one because I think we touched base on them briefly before I hit record, but I feel like we thought all of them were kind of horse feathers as my mahjong playing partner would
Horse
say.
feathers.
Yes.
What does that mean? Irritating?
I think it means like nonsense. She does it when she messes up. She says, "Oh, horse feathers."
Got it. Oh, I will be borrowing that for my tennis game.
It's
But
cute. Yeah.
that is cute. It'll tame my sailor's mouth. But yeah, I'm seeing a lot of recaps, and you and I always are cognizant of walking this line of, all right, I wasn't there. I don't want this to come across as sour grapes. Everybody had a good time drinking rosé without me on a beach. That's what it is. I feel compelled to knock back some of it feels like there's this wave of wisdom that really isn't either actionable or wisdom or wise. So, and
Yeah.
especially around creators, and I want to lay out the caveat that I do not feel that influencers and creators are the same. I think there's a big distinction. For the purposes of this conversation, I'm just going to lump them together.
Yeah. And I'm less strict than you are about that. I use them interchangeably all the time because I just feel like the industry uses them interchangeably all the time and I've given up that fight. But yes, for the purposes of today's episode,
They are the same.
we are going
Well,
to use those two terms willy-nilly.
and P.S., I think the problem is that the industry has confused them. So influencer impact is getting dragged into the stew of creator impact, and they could be wildly different things.
Yeah,
So,
totally.
but okay. So one of the big things last year was the really exciting creator, Can line is going to focus on creator. It's really going to elevate. And everybody is super excited. This year, I think the intention was to continue that momentum, but I'm seeing a little bit of like fatigue around it. Like it wasn't really as shiny and new. And there are okay, so the first one, I'll just jump right into it, is creators need a seat at the table. Everybody loves that, right? That new, like, don't just give them a brief, give them a seat at the table. So I have thoughts about why that is a wildly impossible task and also sets us all off in the wrong direction. I'm wondering, I'll start with you though. Let me ask you, does it trigger you the same way it's triggering me?
It doesn't trigger me as much as it triggers you. Some of my favorite pieces of content have come from creators being able to contribute their ideas and their concepts and creativity and what their audience wants to see. And I my favorite thing to do with briefing, I love comparing it to like a prompt in a creative writing class where you're saying, okay, here's the general concept. Now take it and do your own organic thing with your brand in the way that you do it. So in that sense, like, yes, I think you want to give them a voice. You want to let them take something and put it into their own voice that makes sense and that doesn't feel off for
Hmm.
them. Do I think that they should be like sitting at the table where we're coming up with the brand strategies and looking at the brand goals for the year? Probably not. That feels very overwhelming. And you and I do a lot of work with nano influencers, micro influencers, and that often tends to mean high volume. We can work on a campaign that has 50 influencers on it. They're not all going to have a seat at the table.
Right.
That's ludicrous.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not like.
Okay, so let me pause because the first half of that, I want to challenge you, and it won't really be a challenge for you. That approach, influencers getting the messaging, the goals of the campaign, and then being supported, encouraged to bring it to life in a way that makes sense to their audience and their voice and tone. Has that ever not been part of your process?
Okay. No, of course not. That's always been part of our
Right.
process.
Right.
Yes.
Right. That
Yes.
is just table stakes.
I mean, and honestly, that's why you hire an influencer, right?
Yes.
Because they do have a voice and they do connect with a consumer in a certain way that maybe the brand, like you bring in influencers to tell a story that is better coming from that voice than from the brand voice, and that implies that the influencer has a voice. If they were just going to read a script that came from the brand, you would do it way more cheaply and just hire some Joe off the street to read the script. Like it's
Right. And they know what has already worked and engaged their audience prior to this sponsorship or collaboration. So you're looking for folks who have had that success. PS, that's also called influence, right? No like trust factor. So I want to distinguish that, call that out right from the beginning, that this is not a new concept. It should have always been part of any influencer campaign because of what you've said. And I believe your agency and my agency, through all the iterations and the things we've tried over the years, that has never changed. But
right.
that's why we're tapping them. Now, so what I'm getting at is defining this wisdom around creators need a seat at the table. I believe there's some lofty goals beyond, as you just said, for them to be what? Partners with the brand on strategy. And I think, okay, this does have to do with operations because our agencies are set up to nurture influencers in a specific way without it becoming this drag on the whole program. So that's one thing. But also, a brand team is paid to strategize. They are paid to come up with these. You're asking a brand team to somehow abdicate or give up their raison d'etre in their organization to an outsider, even if that outsider becomes a contractor and an insider, there's going to be tension there. So I think it sounds better in theory than it can actually be pulled off because I think a lot of people are going to feel super sensitive about this.
Let's also talk about like knowledge bases and expertise. So the brand, and I was just talking to a client about this yesterday. We're dealing with she's a PR agency and her client is being very naughty and tricky and pain in the ass.
Huh?
And inserting themselves. And we had this really we were just kind of venting to each other. And she was saying, this is why you can't pull everything in-house at a brand because brands are like, they're so navel gazy and
Myopic.
And thank you, that's better than navel gazy.
I like navel gazy.
When you have everything in-house at a brand, that's when you end up doing an entire activation around the redesign of like one page on your website or like a logo tweak. No one cares except for the people at the brand. So the brand's expertise is in the brand and what they're trying to accomplish and what their sales goals are and marketing goals are. They are all about what's right for the brand. The influencers or the creators, they're all about what's right for their audience. They're their own brand. That's their expertise. If those two are just working together and the brand is all focused on what the brand needs and the influencers are all focused on what their audience needs, who's focused with understanding how this works, what metrics are needed, how we set up the campaign, what's the history of influencer marketing, what have we already tried before and didn't work, what are the FTC rules? Like there's so much that needs to be understood about influencer
100%.
marketing as an industry,
Mm-hmm.
if you have two people whose main concern is propelling their own brand forward,
Yeah.
there's a
Conflict.
crucial piece missing.
Not only a gap, but I do think there's a potential for conflict, and that's where brands write it off and say influencer marketing doesn't work.
Yeah.
It's two silos potentially just banging into each other. A lot of damage can happen along the way. This ties into one of the other areas, and I don't think we're done on that topic by any means.
No, and I want to talk about the Bethany Frankel thing.
Oh yeah, dive
because
into that.
I want to point out that sometimes you can end up with something that feels successful or maybe even is successful when a brand turns everything over to the influencer and they say, go wild, do what you want to do. It can work, sure. There was like this news that came out of Cannes that this Australian skincare makeup brand, I think it's pronounced MCO, it's capital M, capital C, little O, I do not know. And they were working with Pookie, the influencer, and then also with Bethany Frankel.
Mm-hmm.
And Bethany Frankel made this statement that she doesn't do creator briefs. I worked with her over 10 years ago, can confirm, does not listen to a word anyone has to say, is very rude and does her own thing. So that probably did happen. She said, I don't do creator briefs. And so there's this like romantic story that the brand sat down with her and they were on this yacht and she was dressed and looking fabulous. And they played some different YouTube trending songs or sounds for her. And she picked her favorite one. And then there was this dance party that ensued on the yacht to this trending sound. And that became the activation. And it was so successful and wonderful.
Yeah. Okay.
Like, just because that feels like a success to them doesn't negate the need for creator briefs. Like she didn't have to share key. Yeah, she didn't have to share key messages. Like
when the expectation was this is about some. And believe me, there's other takeaways that I really appreciate from Cannes, which is like we are talking to ourselves. We are celebrating creative that the lay public hasn't even seen or been impacted by. So what are we really awarding these prizes to? And I think that's one of those myopic, it does play at Cannes. Like that's the context for it. And on a meta level, it's not reproducible for every or any other brand's regular influencer budget. Like it just doesn't make sense. And it's the adage of a broken clock is right twice a day. So it will be right sometimes. Exactly. I would not say that's a strategy. I think that's one of those places where scale is being substituted for strategy, because Bethany Frankel has an audience, Cannes has this allure to it, So all of those things blend to make it something like
you have this beautiful scenery. You're on a yacht in the middle of the Mediterranean. Everyone looks fabulous.
Yeah,
like,
sure.
That had a lot going for it. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. What I was going to point out is this idea of the silos of the team and creative and knowing brand and the influencer and creative and knowing their audience, that I'm seeing a lot of thought leadership around how there are influencers out there who behave professionally. They over deliver, they meet timelines, they are communicative and engaged, and everybody else who's trying to get brand sponsorships should pay attention to that, should clean up their act, should show up in this professional way, and period. Like no end of story. And I'm pushing back on that because you'll miss 95% of the influencers you want to work with if you only add in the people that are natural systems people, natural fact finders, and who, P.S., any of the creators that were sent and funded to go to Cannes have production teams and staff and like investors. Like they're an
yeah, I think it's really dismissive of smaller brands, of local brands. I obviously love influencer marketing and think it's super effective. I don't think it should be something that's just for the elite brands who can afford to work with these massive creators who have a staff. Not to say that it's just those massive people who are organized. Like we run into micros all the time who are phenomenal and dialed in and are treating this like a career and are great and professional. But we very often work with clients who are we're working with a client who needs to find people in North Dakota and South Dakota. I'm working with another client who needs people in coastal Maine and coastal New Hampshire within a certain like zip code radius. My chances of finding someone who's super dialed in and professional, has done this many times before, and is going to be a pleasure and easy. They might be a pleasure, they might not be easy to work with, and has done this a lot. It's very, very slim. Does that mean that these local, hyper local businesses don't deserve to do influencer marketing? Does this mean that someone who has never, an influencer who has never worked with a brand before, can't work with a brand before?
Right. And that,
or work with a brand ever?
right.
Sorry.
No, those are great questions. And of course, I think we're on the same side of this.
Yeah. They were rhetorical.
There's room.
The answer is no.
The answer is no. But my feeling is, when I look at what the landscape is telling us, is that brand teams, as this industry matures, brand teams and sometimes agency teams are looking for the easy button and the out, instead of doing the very valuable work of putting systems and processes into place to support that influencer activation and collaboration so that it can succeed. And so that the influencers, I just said to Danielle, the brands need to start behaving like benefactors. They need to identify, we're talking about creatives. We're talking about people who almost naturally are going to thrive, maybe with innovation, maybe with spontaneity, maybe with, again, creativity, who naturally are not going to be strong in follow through. They're not going to be strong in research. Solve for that. And I think that the trying to put it back on the influencers, like, well, everybody should change to fit the model of what's perfect. No. You and your team need to get the system better. And to me, that's probably picking at a scab of teams in general, businesses in general are run on MacGyvered together. So they don't even have a good model for internal systems, let alone how to create systems for their influencer. Let me pause there and see if I'm being way too academic about this.
Well, I think you're right. And I don't know if it helps. It made me think back to my days in PR. And when I was at Edelman, we would hire professional spokespeople all the time to do satellite media tours, to do desk sides, to go on the Today Show, go on Good Morning America, do interviews. Yes, these people were telegenic. They had experience doing it. They were a great fit for the brand. Did we ever do any of those things without putting them through media training anyway?
Right.
Never.
Right.
Never.
Mm-hmm.
We always had, and to me, that's like that media training is kind of the equivalent of the creator brief. It reminds them of how to, it's just always great to get a reminder like, okay, the reporter asks you a leading question that is like going to get you away from what you need to be talking about and is kind of controversial, how to redirect them.
Mm-hmm.
Here are the key messages that we want you to get forth. Like,
Yes.
Here's an easy way to say it. Here's like, it reinforces standards about spokesperson I'm just adding an ing to every word, about being a spokesperson in general. And then it also trains on the brand messaging. And that doesn't mean that that spokesperson is not a professional.
And have their own voice and opinion.
It's just that's what you do. And so I don't understand, like, once again, we're finding ourselves in this situation where influencer marketing is being held to this different standard than traditional media. Like with just with measurement, like influencer marketing, because we can measure all of these things, it has to perform. It's suddenly expected to be this driver of conversion because we can measure it. Whereas TV, you can't really measure that very easily. And so we give them a path.
Right. And I think there's an underlying conflict in what you just described. So the movement toward everything can be measured is the important thing to measure then. Because what happens is there's this, I don't want to call it unpredictability, but there's this human element to it. And we haven't nailed how to capture that qualitatively or capture the qualitative quantitatively. And so what I'm seeing is internal brand and agency, quote unquote, experts are advocating for, well, there's nothing we can do. It's unpredictable. You don't know when these things are going to come up. And I'm like, oh no, that's bullshit. You actually can solve for that all ahead of time but they're leaning into, but you got to let creators do what they do. So you can't it's all in service of they don't know how to do it. So they're going to say it's not their fault, it's the fault of the ecosystem.
And I think there's a very big difference between handing someone a script.
Sure.
And letting someone know, here's what we're trying to accomplish. Here are our key messages.
Yep.
Go at it in your own way.
Yeah.
Like
which
that,
of these
to me,
messages resonates with your audience?
Right.
How are you going to showcase that? Tell us why this excites you. Give us your feedback there. We want you to be part of that.
There's no problem with that. Like, and any influencer worth their salt should want to know what the brand's trying to accomplish. Like, shame on Bethany Frankel for saying she doesn't do creator briefs. Well, then how? Like, she just doesn't care about doing good work for that brand.
Right. She's a brand.
Likely.
See, that's the thing. She's a brand. And so
you have to like just hope that your brand message meshes with her, and you're going to just throw in the key messages as you know, text overlay.
as like photobomb. Like you're just going to bomb the back of her content with your brand and hope that it lands. And that's a strategy. Yeah, there's so much in here that we could keep going into, but
I think there was one more edict, I think, that was coming.
Yes.
Did we get through 2? You had 3.
Yeah, let me check because one was creators at the table.
Creators at the table.
The other one was long-term partnerships versus one-off, which really goes into this.
And were you were hearing that long-term partnerships are dead or are the way to go?
The only thing we should be doing is long-term partnerships.
They're saying
that's it. One-offs are
I have some clients who would really beg to differ.
Of course. First of all, every influencer campaign relationship starts as a one-off. It just does. Like you're not contracting them for 10 years. And you've even said, we don't even do a year necessarily. We'll do a quarter. We'll do 6 months. Okay, if you're calling that long-term, there's some variables at play there.
What if the first piece of content does terribly? Like you think it's a good fit and you think it's going to do well and it does terribly, but now you're stuck using this person multiple times throughout the year. What if it's a very simple brand and there's not more than one story to tell?
Right, exactly. But what I'm fascinated by and want to highlight here is, again, this wisdom of let's all do long-term partnerships. I'm seeing it in reference to reducing risk, that somehow you mitigate the risk of working with influencers because now the influencers are more bought in. Now the influencers are part of the brand. And I'm here to tell you, if you haven't done that in your one-offs, shame on you, because they still should be welcomed into the brand. They still should be respected and nurtured. It doesn't have to be a long-term. Again, I think it's weird to say in 2025, almost second half of the year, that we still think influencers, it's acceptable for them to ghost or to go rogue. In what context is that okay? I was thinking about an analogy, like if I hired somebody to come into my house and paint the nursery wall with a mural that is, the colors I want and really cute for a baby nursery, I give a creative brief and then that artist takes over. I should not be surprised at what ends up happening. There shouldn't be goth imagery. There shouldn't be vampires, right? Like I have a pretty clear expectation that our needs, our visions are going to match somewhat.
Yeah.
And I guess
I don't understand the correlation between ambassador and lower risk. Because I think there are cases where working with someone in a long-term relationship is more risky. Like that is really making a statement. And we do ambassadorships all the time, and sometimes it's the way to go. I think what I'm going to put words in your mouth, what Casey and I are both saying is that one is not better than the other. Right. They both have their places. But when you pull someone in as an ambassador and you are stating that they are a repeat spokesperson for your brand, you are really putting the weight of your brand behind that person, and you are putting out there that there is this alignment. And so these are humans, let's not forget. And if something goes wrong and they step out of line or they have an oopsie or they get arrested whatever happens, like if
humaning.
If you did a one-off, that's lower on the risk scale. If this is someone that you said, this is the face of our brand, that's much that's
It becomes the
brand.
face of your brand. I
Yeah.
think that's maybe what
Yeah.
we're not understanding as folks, strategists who are making those decisions. That long term becomes ambassadorship. It becomes the face of the brand. It becomes a little bit more locked in, and the margin for error becomes much smaller because of that impact. And by the way, you're reaching pretty much the same audience through that person over and over and over again. Not that there aren't ways to mitigate that or to expand that.
Sure.
But that's another, and it, even with the perceived professional gems out there and the wisdom to only work with them and the wisdom to work only long term, they actually are going to get more and more expensive. So you're not saving yourself from that risk either of the investment levels. You know, the more professional folks are going to get rebooked. They are going to raise their rates. They are going to be harder to book. They are going to have more crowded landscape inventory. So now you're one of many brands maybe that's working with them.
We just we're doing an ambassador program for one of our brands, and we're working with 6 different ambassadors. We negotiated ambassador rate, like a year-long per post rate for each of them, with the understanding that they would do multiple posts throughout the year. A couple of them have management, but one of the ones who has a manager, we completed 2 posts with her. We went back to talk about a third, and her manager suddenly let us know that they wanted 4 times the rate that we had negotiated.
You'd already negotiated a contract, did it?
Yeah. I mean, it was, we had contracted for the 2 posts with the understanding that there would be another 4 coming at that same rate. There was like a back and forth in writing. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then they came back and, oh, now that we see that this is successful, we'd really like it to be more in line with her standard rate, blah, blah, blah. Long story short, they wanted 4 times more per post.
That's
like
wild.
That nonsense is going to happen no matter what you do. Like calling someone ambassador doesn't make you immune.
Right.
From that sort of thing.
Right. Exactly. It doesn't. Yeah. All right. Where do we go from there? I think we did cover the 3, and there's so many more, and it's so layered. I like your point about having a knowledgeable, high touch agency as a layer in between these 2.
I won't take any chance to pimp out using a knowledgeable agency.
Well, and one of the arguments that I'm also hearing, bonus, is the brands want to own those relationships. Again, been hearing that since we started. It's not an either or, it's a yes and. And P.S., you cannot own those relationships at scale without significant resources and person power, developing community.
My issue is with the word own. So we will never stand in the way of a relationship.
Right.
Like, yes, of course, the brand should absolutely have a relationship with the influencer. That will only make the content better. Mm-hmm. Does the brand need to be in charge of all of the logistics and every single conversation and all of the back and forth? No.
Right.
In fact, we often see that when influencers, again, like not to keep digging on managers, but when they have management, if there are 2 different parties having conversations with that influencer, they will play them off of each other. And if there's confusion as to who's in charge of the contracting and the negotiation and the logistics,
it kills
managers and savvy influencers negotiating on their own behalf will take advantage of that to try to push their rate higher, get more for themselves. So I think it's like, I think owning a relationship is kind of a squicky term in general.
Yep.
What I would say is there should just be very clear boundaries. Anything that's contract related, that is talking about the specifics of the contracts and the deliverables and the negotiations, like that, if there's an agency involved, that should all fall to the agency.
For sure.
Having a connection, sharing info about the brand, seeing each other at events, commenting on posts, like absolutely the brand should be totally involved in that, but not involved in the business side of things if there is an agency, because all that does is muddy the waters.
Yeah, and confusion is going to kill momentum. It's going to kill strategy, going to kill outcomes. And I would add to that, find an agency that is high touch and who you are very direct and detail how that agency will support relationship building. I've told this story in a past episode of working with a client running this program, but we knew what the client's further endeavors were and elements of their marketing budget and plan. And so we had eyes on which influencers to introduce into that pipeline to support those other things. That was a very vague way of saying it, but a good agency should be seeing your entire marketing plan and your other efforts and being additive where those relationships. Otherwise, as a brand, please, you do not need all the noise of 50 relationships and 50 sets of needs coming at you. Let your agency slice and dice and make the most. But again, if on the brand side you want to quote unquote own it, which I think means having a connective tissue or a very formative relationship, that is community building. It's worthwhile. It's expensive. It's time consuming. It needs a designation of resources that is not the same as an influencer strategy. They are complementary, but different. And your agency can and should help you with that too. Yeah. Yay for agencies.
Woohoo. This was fun. Thank you for the topic idea.
Absolutely. Thanks for entertaining it.
Okay. We'll see you next week.
Bye.